Before we begin, here's something most people never realize about Medusa. What if I told you she wasn't born a monster at all? In some of the oldest versions of her story, Medusa was once known for her beauty, her calm life, and her devotion inside a sacred temple. But then, everything changed in a way that feels unfair, sudden, and almost impossible to escape. And here's the part people don't usually talk about. The same power that made her feared was later used by heroes as a weapon. So tonight, we're not rushing this story. We're going to slow it down, piece by piece, and see what really happened behind the legend of Medusa. But before we begin, I'm curious. Where are you watching this from right now? And what time is it where you are? Let me know in the comments. I always read them, and it's honestly fascinating seeing how far these stories travel around the world. And if you enjoy slow, calming stories like this, the kind that help you relax, unwind, or even fall asleep, consider subscribing. Now, let's begin. You know, it's kind of strange when you think about it. Almost everyone has heard of Medusa, the snake hair, the stone gaze, the terrifying legend, but very few people ever stop and ask a simple question. What was she like before all of that? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Medusa wasn't always a monster. In fact, long before anyone feared her, people admired her. Imagine a quiet temple, somewhere in ancient Greece, not loud, not chaotic, just soft echoes of footsteps on cold stone, the faint smell of incense, and the low whisper of prayers carried by the wind. This is where Medusa lived, not as a creature, but as a priestess. Her life was simple, and in a way, peaceful. She wasn't chasing power. She wasn't seeking attention. She wasn't trying to be remembered by history. She was just there, living a life devoted to something higher, something sacred, the kind of life that most myths don't really care to talk about, because it's not dramatic enough. But sometimes, the quietest lives hide the most tragic endings. Now, depending on which ancient source you read, Medusa wasn't even born a monster. She was one of 3 sisters, the Gorgons. But here's where it gets interesting. Her 2 sisters were immortal creatures from the very beginning. Medusa, she was different. She was mortal, and that one detail changes everything about her story. Because being mortal means something very specific. It means you can be hurt, you can be changed, you can be broken. Her sisters were feared from the start, but Medusa was something else entirely. Some stories describe her as incredibly beautiful, not just pretty in a casual way, but the kind of beauty that makes people stop and stare a little too long, the kind that becomes a problem. And that's where things start to feel a little uncomfortable, because in many ancient Greek stories, beauty isn't always a blessing. Sometimes it's the beginning of a curse. Think about it. If someone stands out too much, if they draw too much attention, especially in a world filled with powerful gods who act on impulse, it doesn't usually end well. And Medusa stood out a lot. Some accounts even say her ironically was her most admired feature. Long, flowing, almost hypnotic. People noticed her. They talked about her, and whether she wanted it or not, she became someone that others watched. But here's something most people don't realize. In certain versions of the myth, Medusa made a choice that showed her character more than anything else. She chose a life of devotion. She became a priestess, often associated with a sacred temple commonly linked to Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war. And this wasn't just a casual role. It came with expectations, strict ones, purity, discipline, commitment, a life that required control, especially over oneself. So now you have this image, a woman known for her beauty, choosing a life where that beauty doesn't matter, where attention isn't the goal, where silence is. And honestly, there's something quietly admirable about that, but also something fragile, because the more someone tries to live quietly, the more devastating it is when that quiet life is taken away. And in Medusa's case, it wasn't just taken, it was shattered. Now here's where we get into one of the most debated and, honestly, disturbing parts of her story, because something happened inside that temple, and depending on who tells the story, the details change. Some ancient writers describe it as a moment of desire from a powerful god. Others describe it in a way that feels much darker, much less consensual, much more violating. And that difference, it matters a lot, because if Medusa had no control over what happened, then everything that comes after isn't just tragic, it's deeply unfair. And here's the shocking part most people never talk about. In many versions of the myth, Medusa is punished. Not the god, not the one with power, her. Think about that for a second. A woman living a disciplined, quiet life in a sacred place loses control over her situation and somehow ends up being the one who pays the price. If that sounds familiar in a broader human sense, it's because this pattern shows up again and again throughout history and storytelling, and maybe that's why Medusa's story still feels so uncomfortable, because deep down, it doesn't just feel like a myth, it feels like something that shouldn't have happened, but it did. And this moment, this turning point inside a quiet temple, is where everything begins to change, slowly at first, and then all at once, because what comes next isn't just a punishment, it's a transformation, one that takes everything she was and turns it into something the world would fear forever. You know, sometimes a life doesn't fall apart all at once. Sometimes it shifts quietly, almost invisibly, until one day you realize nothing is the same anymore. And for Medusa, that shift didn't start with the curse itself. It started with attention, the kind of attention that feels flattering at first, but slowly becomes something heavier. Because here's the thing about being noticed in a world like ancient Greece, especially by gods, it's never neutral. It always leads somewhere, and usually not somewhere good. Medusa didn't ask to stand out. She didn't try to be seen, but beauty, especially the kind described in her story, doesn't really give you a choice. People look, people talk, and eventually the wrong being notices you. Shocking fact, in many Greek myths, being too beautiful is almost treated like a flossing thing that attracts danger rather than protection, and Medusa, without realizing it, was already walking into that pattern long before anything actually happened. Now imagine this. You're living in a place that's supposed to protect you, a temple, a sacred space, somewhere rules exist to keep things pure, controlled, untouched. That's what Medusa believed she had, a place where the outside world and all its chaos couldn't reach her. But Greek mythology has a habit of breaking its own rules. Gods don't follow boundaries the way humans do. They don't knock, they don't ask. And when they want something, they take it. One of those gods often said to be Poseidon, the god of the sea and tide, her story, and not gentle. This is where the myth becomes uncomfortable, because different versions try to soften what happened, while others are much more direct. But if you read between the lines, or even just read certain classical texts, it becomes clear that Medusa wasn't in control of that moment. Shocking fact, the most famous, detailed version from Ovid strongly suggests that what happened was not a mutual encounter, but something forced, and yet the blame never followed the one with power. And that's where the real tragedy starts to form, not just in what happened, but in what happened next. Because you might at least from a modern perspective that the one responsible would face consequences. But this is Greek mythology, and justice doesn't work the way we'd hope. Instead of protection, Medusa faced judgment, and not from just anyone but from Athena, the very goddess whose temple she served. think about that for a moment. The place that was supposed to be sacred was now seen as defiled, and rather than seeing Medusa as someone who was wronged, the focus shifted to the violation of the temple itself. It's a subtle shift in perspective, but it changes everything, because now Medusa isn't viewed as a victim, she's treated as part of the problem. Shocking fact, in some interpretations, Athena's punishment wasn't about cruelty, but about preserving her temple's honor. Meaning, Medusa's suffering became secondary to symbolism, and maybe that's the most unsettling part of this entire story. Not the snakes, not the stone gaze, but the idea that someone could lose everything and still be the one held responsible. Medusa didn't just lose her safety that day, she lost her identity, the life she built, the discipline she maintained, the quiet purpose she held onto. All of it became meaningless in the eyes of the gods. And when that happens in mythology, it usually leads to transformation, not the kind that empowers, but the kind that isolates. Because once a person is redefined by something they didn't choose, there's no easy way back. And Medusa was about to be redefined in the most extreme way possible. Shocking fact, Medusa is the only Gorgon whose origin story involves transformation. Her sisters were born monsters, but she was turned into one. That difference makes her story less about fear and more about loss. So if you've ever thought of Medusa as just a monster, this is the moment where that idea starts to fall apart. Because monsters, at least in stories, are usually born to be feared, but Medusa wasn't. She was made, slowly, painfully, and perhaps unfairly. And as we move forward into what comes next, try to hold on to that version of her, not the one with snakes for hair, not the one turning people to stone, but the one who once lived in silence, in a temple, believing she was safe, because the next part of her story, the actual curse, isn't just about becoming something terrifying. It's about what's left behind when everything human is taken away, alright? This is where things change, not suddenly, not with a loud dramatic moment like in movies, but in a way that feels almost quiet at first. And that's what makes it more unsettling, because the curse of Medusa wasn't just about turning into something terrifying, it was about being slowly stripped of everything she used to be. Imagine standing there in the same place where your life fell apart, not knowing what comes next, and then realizing that whatever is about to happen, you won't be able to stop it. In many retellings, there's no long explanation, no warning, no chance to defend herself, just a decision made by a goddess. And that's it. Your life is no longer yours. Shocking fact. In Greek mythology, curses are often immediate and irreversible. There's almost never a moment where the victim can argue or escape, especially when a god has already decided their fate. Now picture this transformation, but not as something loud or monstrous right away. Think of it as something creeping, something wrong, something that starts small. Maybe it begins with a strange sensation, your body no longer feeling familiar, your reflection no longer matching who you think you are. Her hair, once admired, once soft and flowing, begins to change, not instantly into a crown of aggressive snakes, like we often see in modern art, but gradually, subtly, like something living is replacing something human. And that's the disturbing part. Tits not just physical, it's symbolic. The very thing she was known for, the thing people praised her for, becomes the first thing taken away from her. Shocking fact, in many myths, punishments are designed to target what made someone unique, turning their strength or identity into the source of their suffering, and then her face, not turning to stone like some later artistic versions, show but becoming something people can no longer look at without fear. There's something deeply tragic about that if you think about it. A face that once drew admiration now forces people to look away. Or worse, because the curse didn't stop at appearance, it gave her something far more isolating, a power she never asked for, a gaze that could turn anyone who looked at her into stone just like that. No warning, no control at first, just irreversible consequences. Shocking fact, Medusa's petrifying gaze is one of the earliest mythological examples of involuntary harm, meaning she becomes dangerous simply by existing, not by choosing to hurt anyone. And this is where the story becomes less about transformation and more about isolation, because imagine realizing that you can no longer be around anyone, not safely. You can't talk to someone you can't exist in society. You can't even be seen without risking their life. It's not just a curse of appearance, it's a complete removal from humanity. And that's something people often overlook when they think about Medusa. They focus on how she looks, but not on what she loses. Her voice, her connection, her place in the world. All gone. Shocking fact. Unlike many other cursed figures in mythology, Medusa doesn't get a second chance, a redemption arc, or a reversal. Her story only moves forward, and it only gets darker. So when people imagine Medusa as a monster hiding in isolation, it's easy to forget that she didn't choose that life. It was forced onto her, step by step, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of the person she used to be, at least on the outside. But here's something to hold on to as we continue. Just because someone is seen as a monster doesn't mean they stop feeling like a human inside. And that's what makes this next part even heavier, because now that the transformation has begun, we have to ask something much deeper. What happens to a person when the world leaves them behind, but they're still fully aware of everything they've lost? So, what happens after the transformation is complete? Not the dramatic moment itself, but the quiet hours that follow. The part no one really talks about, because once the curse settles in, once Medusa realizes what she has become, there's no guide, no explanation, no one waiting to help her understand it, just silence. And that silence is important. Imagine trying to move to exist, to even breathe normally, while knowing that something about you is now dangerous to everyone else, not by choice, not by anger, just by being there. And at first, maybe she doesn't even fully understand it. Maybe the first time someone turns to stone, it's an accident, a moment of confusion, a reflex. And then, suddenly, someone who was alive just seconds ago is gone, frozen forever. Shocking fact. In many interpretations of the myth, Medusa's power isn't something she learns to control immediately, something she discovers through unintended consequences, which makes her early existence even more tragic. Now think about how quickly that realization would change everything. One moment you're alone, and the next you understand that you have to be alone, not because you want to be, but because it's the only way to keep others safe. That's a very different kind of isolation. It's not just being rejected bits, choosing distance for the sake of others. And that choice, even if forced, says a lot about who Medusa still is underneath the curse. Because if she truly became a monster in the way people imagine, she wouldn't care. But the fact that she withdraws, that she disappears from human spaces, suggests something else entirely. It suggests awareness, maybe even guilt. Shocking fact. Unlike many mythical creatures who actively hunt or seek destruction, Medusa is often portrayed as stationary in one place, rather than going out into the world, which hints that she's avoiding harm rather than causing it. And where does she go? That's another detail that adds to the atmosphere of her story. Medusa doesn't stay in the temple. She leaves, or maybe she's driven out. Either way, she ends up in a place far removed from normal life, often described as a remote, desolate area, a place where very few would ever wander by accident, and over time, that place becomes something else, not just a hiding spot, but a kind of silent graveyard. Statues begin to appear, not built, not carved with intention, but created by the curse itself. Each one a frozen moment, a person who got too close, or didn't understand the danger in time. And this is where the imagery people associate with Medusa really starts to form. The stillness, the emptiness, the feeling that everything around her is paused permanently. Shocking fact, ancient descriptions of Medusa's surroundings often emphasize stillness and lifelessness, not chaos, which is unusual compared to other monster myths that focus on destruction and violence. But here's something that makes the story even heavier when you really sit with it. Those statues aren't just random figures. They're reminders, constant, unavoidable reminders of what she's become. Imagine waking up every day and seeing the consequences of your existence surrounding you, not something you can forget, not something you can escape, but something that defines your space entirely. It's not just isolation anymore, it's a kind of emotional weight that never lifts, and over time, that kind of environment changes a person. Even if they started out gentler, even if they didn't choose any of this, living like that, day after day, it has an effect. Shocking fact, in later artistic interpretations, Medusa's lair is sometimes filled with figures in poses of fear or surprise, suggesting their final moments were sudden, which reinforces the idea that many victims didn't even understand what was happening. So by the time people begin to speak of Medusa as a monster, something important has already happened. The story has shifted. The world no longer sees the girl from the temple. They don't see the transformation as something tragic. They see the result, and they react to it. Fear spreads faster than understanding ever could, and once a story becomes about fear, it rarely goes back. Medusa becomes a warning, a symbol, something to avoid, something to defeat. But if you slow it down, if you look at it from her side, it feels very different. It feels like a life that kept narrowing until there was nothing left but survival. And that's where we are now. Not at the beginning, not even at the transformation, but in the quiet aftermath, where the real weight of the curse finally settles in. And from here, the world doesn't get kinder, it gets curious. And curiosity, in stories like this, is what brings the next kind of danger. You'd think, after everything that happened, the story would just end there. A quiet exile, a life hidden away, far from people, far from harm. But stories, especially ones from ancient Greece, don't really allow that kind of ending, because no matter how far someone runs, the world has a way of catching up, and in Medusa's case, it wasn't kindness that found her. It was curiosity, fear, and eventually ambition. People began to talk, not about who she was, but about what she had become. A creature, a monster, a warning whispered between travelers and told around fires at night. Don't go near that place, they'd say. There's something there, something that turns people to stone. And just like that, Medusa stopped being a person in the story and became a legend people wanted to test. Shocking fact. In many ancient myths, once a figure becomes a story, it almost guarantees someone will eventually try to confront its curiosity, and the desire for glory often override fear. Now here's where things take a different kind of turn, because the people who come looking for Medusa, they're not always lost travelers or innocent wanderers. Some of them come on purpose, drawn by the idea of proving something, of becoming known. In a world where heroes are remembered and ordinary lives are forgotten, facing something dangerous isn't just reckless, it's an opportunity. And Medusa, without ever choosing it, becomes that opportunity for others. Think about how strange that is. Her curse doesn't just isolate her, it turns her into a stepping stone for someone else's story. And over time, the rumors grow. They don't stay simple. They become exaggerated, twisted, sharpened into something more dramatic than the truth. Her gaze becomes more deadly, her appearance more monstrous, her presence more terrifying. Shocking fact: many of the most extreme details about Medusa's appearance, like exaggerated, monstrous features, come from later, not the earliest versions, showing how stories evolve to become more sensational over time. And the more the story spreads, the less anyone questions it. That's the part that feels a little too real, even today. Once a narrative becomes widely accepted, people stop asking where it came from. They stop wondering if it's fair. Medusa is no longer seen as someone who was transformed, just the monster who turns people to stone. That's it. That becomes her identity in the eyes of the world. And when enough people believe something like that, it shapes reality. Not her reality, but how everyone else treats her, which in the end affects her life just as much. Because now, it's not just about avoiding people. It's about knowing that anyone who does come near you might not be there by accident. They might be there because they've heard your name and they want something from it. Shocking fact: in heroic Greek myths, defeating a monster wasn't just survival, it was often a direct path to fame, meaning figures like Medusa became targets rather than simply dangers. And maybe, somewhere in all of this, Medusa understands what's happening. Maybe she realizes that she's no longer just hiding from the world, she's being hunted by it, not in a constant, aggressive way, but in a slow, inevitable one, because all it takes is one determined person, one hero, one story that needs a villain. And once that kind of attention is set in motion, it doesn't really stop. It builds quietly, gradually, until one day someone arrives who isn't just curious, but prepared. And that's what makes the next part different, because up until now, the danger around Medusa has been accidental, unintended, but soon it becomes deliberate, planned, directed at her. Shocking fact: Medusa's story shifts from tragedy to confrontation the moment a hero enters the narrative, because from that point on, the focus moves away from her suffering and toward someone else's victory. So if you pause here for a moment, you can feel the tension starting to build, even without anything dramatic happening yet. A quiet life, forced into isolation, slowly turning into a legend, that legend turning into a challenge, and that challenge attracting someone who wants to win. It's almost like Medusa's fate is being rewritten again, not by the gods this time, but by the expectations of the world around her. And the question isn't if someone will come, it's when, because in stories like this, once a monster exists, a hero is never far behind. And when that hero finally arrives, the story won't be about who Medusa was, it will be about what someone else did to her. And eventually, that someone does arrive, not by accident, not out of curiosity alone, but with a purpose already decided before he even gets close. His name is Perseus, and if you've heard anything about Greek mythology, you probably already know how this part of the story usually ends. But what's interesting isn't just what he does, it's why he comes in the first place, because Perseus isn't wandering, and he's not reacting to Medusa personally. He's sent, given a mission, and that mission is to bring back Medusa's head, just like that, not to understand her, not to confront her story, not to question what she is or how she became that way, just to end her. And when you really sit with that, it changes the tone of everything, because now Medusa isn't just being avoided, she's being targeted. Shocking fact: in many versions of the myth, Perseus doesn't choose. Medusa as a personal enemy who's ordered to kill her as part of a separate conflict, meaning her death is tied to someone else's political or personal agenda. Now think about the difference between those two things, being feared versus being hunted. Fear keeps people away, hunting brings them closer. And Perseus isn't just brave, he's prepared in a way no one before him has been. He doesn't walk in blindly like the others who became statues. He comes with knowledge, with tools, with help from the gods themselves. Athena, the same figure connected to Medusa's curse, plays a role again, this time aiding Perseus. And that detail feels heavy because it means the story isn't just about a hero versus a monster. It's about a system of power that continues to move against Medusa. Even after everything she's already lost, Perseus is given what he needs. A reflective shield so he doesn't have to look at her directly, a weapon to strike, and guidance on how to succeed. Shocking fact, Perseus defeats Medusa not through strength alone, but by avoiding direct eye contact, meaning the fight isn't really a fight in the traditional sense, but a carefully controlled execution. And while all of this is being prepared, Medusa is still where she's always been, in isolation, in stillness. There's no grand build-up from her side, no awareness that someone specifically is coming for her. That's what makes this part feel so one-sided, because in most heroic stories, both sides move toward each other. There's tension, anticipation, maybe even confrontation, but here, it's different. One side is planning, equipping, strategizing, the other is simply existing, and that imbalance is easy to miss if you only hear the story from the hero's perspective. But if you slow it down, it becomes impossible to ignore. Shocking fact, Medusa is often described as sleeping when Perseus arrives in some versions of the myth, which removes even the possibility of a direct confrontation between them. And then there's this uncomfortable question that sits underneath everything. What makes someone a hero? Is it bravery? Is it success? Or is it simply being the one whose story gets told from the beginning? Because if you look at this moment from Medusa's side, there's no hero arriving. There's just someone coming to take the last thing she has left her life. And from Perseus's side, there's no tragedy. There's just a task, a goal, something to accomplish. Two completely different perspectives existing in the same moment, and only one of them is remembered as victory. Shocking fact, after Medusa's death, her head continues to be used as a weapon by Perseus, turning enemies to stone, meaning even in death, she remains a tool in someone else's story. So as we move closer to that final encounter, it's worth holding onto both sides of the story at once. Not just the version where a hero defeats a monster, but the version where a person who lost everything is about to lose the only thing she has left. Because what's about to happen isn't loud or dramatic in the way you might expect. It's quiet, precise, almost clinical, and in a way, that makes it even more unsettling, because the end of Medusa's story doesn't come from chaos. It comes from someone who knew exactly what they were doing and was never really in danger at all. Now imagine Medusa in that moment, not as the terrifying figure from paintings, but as someone who has spent so long in isolation that the world outside barely feels real anymore. There's no warning, no sign that this particular visitor is different from the others who wandered too close. And in some versions, she isn't even awake, she's resting. Still unaware, that detail alone shifts everything, because it removes even the possibility of resistance. There's no confrontation, no choice, no final words, just an ending that arrives without announcement. And that's what makes it unsettling, not the act itself, but the absence of struggle. Shocking fact, several classical sources describe Medusa as asleep when Perseus finds her, suggesting that the defining moment of her story happens without her ever seeing it coming. And then it happens, quickly, precisely, almost quietly. Perseus uses the reflection from his shield, avoiding her gaze, and strikes. There's no chaos described, no prolonged scene, just a single decisive action, and just like that, the story of Medusa as a living being ends. But even here, even in death, the story doesn't behave the way you'd expect, because something else happens in that moment, something unexpected. From her body, new life emerges, creatures that were never part of her story before. Most famously, Pegasus, the winged horse, is said to be born at the moment of her death. And if you pause on that for a second, it's almost surreal. Out of something tragic, something harsh, comes something almost beautiful. Shocking fact: Pegasus and another figure, Chrysaor, are said to have been born from Medusa after her death, linking her story not just to tragedy, but to the origin of other important mythological figures. But even that detail carries a strange kind of weight, because it means Medusa's story doesn't fully belong to her. Even at the end, her death becomes a transition point for other stories to begin. And Perseus, he doesn't just leave things behind, he takes something with him, her head. And that might be one of the most unsettling parts of all, because even after her life ends, her power doesn't. The ability to turn others to stone remains, preserved, carried forward, used, again and again. And that raises a quiet question. Does her story really end here, or does it just change form? Shocking fact: Perseus continues to use Medusa's head as a weapon in multiple later events, meaning her presence continues to shape outcomes long after her death. So if you look at this moment from a distance, it seems simple. A hero succeeds, a monster is defeated, the story moves on. But if you slow it down, if you stay with it a little longer, it feels very different. It feels like the end of something that never really had a chance to be understood, a life that started quietly, changed without consent, and ended without resistance. And now, what's left isn't just silence, it's a legacy, not the one Medusa chose, but one that continues to echo through every part of the story that follows. You'd think, after a moment like that, the story would finally come to rest, that once Medusa is gone, everything connected to her would slowly fade into silence. But that's not how this story works. In fact, her death doesn't feel like an ending at all. It feels like a transition, because even though her life ends in that quiet, almost unnoticed moment, her presence doesn't disappear. It continues, just in a different form. Perseus takes her head with him, not as something to bury, not as something to respect, but as something to use. And that detail alone shifts the entire meaning of what just happened, because now Medusa isn't just remembered as a monster, she becomes a tool, a weapon, something carried from place to place, brought out only when needed. Shocking fact: in Greek mythology, Medusa's head retains its power even after death, meaning her ability to turn people into stone continues long after her life has ended. And what's even more unsettling is how effective that power still is. Perseus uses it again and again, not in desperation, but almost strategically. When he faces enemies, when he needs to win quickly, he reveals the head, and everything stops. Instantly, permanently. There's no struggle, no second chance, just the same stillness that once surrounded Medusa in her isolated world. And if you think about it, that same stillness now follows Perseus wherever he goes. It's no longer confined to one place. It spreads, quietly, efficiently, and no one questions it, because now it's in the hands of a hero. Shocking fact: Perseus uses Medusa's head to defeat multiple opponents, including powerful figures, showing that her curse becomes one of the most useful weapons in heroic mythology. And that's where Medusa's identity shifts one final time from a person to a monster, to an object, and finally to a symbol that outlives her completely. Her story becomes something people reference without fully understanding. Her image makes stone gaze, frozen expressions into something almost iconic. But the quiet parts of her life, the temple, the isolation, the transformation, those details fade into the background. What remains is the simplified version, the one that fits easily into stories about heroes and victories. And maybe that's what makes this ending feel incomplete, because the more her image is used, the less her experience is remembered. Shocking fact, Medusa's face later becomes known as the Gorgoneme, a symbol used in ancient Greece to ward off evil meaning. Her terrifying image was believed to offer protection rather than harm, so when you step back and look at everything, it doesn't really feel like justice was ever part of this story. It feels like movement, one event leading to another, one transformation leading to another, until the original person at the center of it all is almost impossible to see. Medusa's life doesn't end with understanding or resolution or even acknowledgement. It ends with continuation, her power moving on, her image being reused, her story reshaped to fit whatever comes next. And maybe that's the final, quiet truth of it all. Sometimes, in stories like this, the most important part isn't how someone begins, or even how they end, but how easily the world moves on, without ever really stopping to understand them. You know what's strange? After everything we've just walked through, the quiet life, the sudden shift, the curse, the isolation, the ending, you'd expect Medusa's story to be remembered in all its complexity. But that's not what happened. What people remember is something much simpler, much shorter, much easier to retell. A monster with snakes for hair, a gaze that turns people to stone, and a hero who defeats it. That's it. That's the version that survives. And if you've ever heard of Medusa before this, there's a good chance that's the version you knew too. And honestly, that's how most stories evolve over time. The details that are uncomfortable, the parts that raise questions, they slowly fade away, leaving behind something cleaner, more direct, easier to pass on. Shocking fact, the earliest Greek sources don't all describe Medusa's tragic backstory. The idea that she was once human and transformed became more detailed in later especially by writers like Ovid. And once a story becomes simple, it spreads faster, because people don't need to explain it. They don't need to pause and think about it. They just repeat it. Medusa becomes a symbol of danger, a warning, something parents might reference, something storytellers use to create tension. And over time, that simplified version starts to feel like the truth, even if it leaves out most of what actually makes the story meaningful. Because think about it, how often do people talk about her life before the curse, or what happened inside that temple, or the fact that she never really chose any of this? Those parts don't fit as neatly into a quick retelling, so they disappear. Shocking fact, in many classical Greek artworks, Medusa is depicted as purely monstrous, without any hint of a human past, showing that even in ancient times, her story was already being simplified visually. And then something even more interesting happens. Medusa's image starts to appear in places that have nothing to do with her original story, on shields, on buildings, on objects meant to protect rather than harm. Her face once fear becomes something people intentionally display, almost like they're using fear itself as a defense. And that's such a strange transformation when you think about it, because now the same features that made her an outcast are being used as a symbol of strength, of protection, of power. Shocking fact, the image of Medusa, known as the Gorgonion, was commonly used in ancient Greece as an symbol, meaning it was believed to ward off evil and protect the wearer or the place it was displayed. But even as her image spreads, her story continues to shift depending on who's telling it. In some versions, she's nothing more than a creature to be defeated. In others, there's a hint of tragedy, but it's not the focus. And rarely, very rarely, do people stop and look at the entire arc of her life. From beginning to end, it's almost like the world chose the version of Medusa that was easiest to understand, rather than the one that was closest to the truth. And maybe that says something not just about mythology, but about storytelling in general. We tend to remember what fits, what's clear, what doesn't challenge us too much. Shocking facts. Different ancient authors present Medusa in completely different ways, which means there's no single original version of her story, only layers of interpretation built over time. So when you hear the name Medusa now, it probably brings up a very specific image: snakes, stone, fear. But behind that image, there's a much quieter story, one that doesn't get told as often. A story about a life that changed without warning, about a person who lost control over everything, and about how quickly the world can forget those details once a simpler version takes hold. And as we keep going, we're going to move even further away from the events themselves, and closer to something else entirely, not just what happened to Medusa, but what her story started to mean, and how that meaning kept changing long after she was gone. And this is where things get even more interesting, because once a story like this leaves its original time, it doesn't stay the same. It changes, slowly at first, then more noticeably, until you end up with versions that feel completely different from where they started. And Medusa's story is one of the clearest examples of that. Over time, she stops being just a figure in Greek mythology and becomes something people reinterpret, depending on what they need the story to say. Some see her as a monster, others begin to see something else entirely. And that shift, it doesn't happen all at once. It happens across generations, across cultures, across people asking the same quiet question: what if we've been looking at her the wrong way this whole time? Shocking fact, there is no single fixed version of Medusa. Her story has been rewritten and reinterpreted for over 2,000 years, often reflecting the values of the time more than the original myth itself. If you move forward into later periods, especially Roman retellings, and even much later into modern interpretations, you start to notice something subtle but important. The focus begins to shift away from the monster aspect and toward the before. People become more interested in who Medusa was, not just what she became. Writers, artists, and thinkers begin to revisit the earlier parts of her story, asking whether her transformation was fair, whether her punishment made sense, whether she was ever meant to be seen as evil at all. And once that door opens, it changes everything, because now the story isn't just about fear, it's about perspective. Shocking fact, the version of Medusa as a tragic figure wronged by the gods becomes especially prominent in later literature, influenced heavily by interpretations like those of Ovid, who emphasized the injustice in her transformation. And then, something even more unexpected happens. Medusa starts to become a symbol, just an ancient protective imagery like the Gorgonion, in a much more personal, human way. Some interpretations begin to see her as a symbol of injustice, of someone punished for something beyond her control. Others see her as a representation of isolation, what it feels like to be cut off from the world, misunderstood, avoided. And in more recent readings, she's even been viewed as a symbol of resilience, someone who, despite everything, continues to exist, to endure, to have an impact long after her story should have ended. Shocking fact: in modern interpretations, Medusa is sometimes reimagined not as a villain, but as a figure of empowerment, showing how dramatically a story's meaning can evolve over time. But here's the thing, none of these interpretations fully replace the older ones. They all exist at the same time, which means Medusa becomes something rare in storytelling, a figure with multiple identities, all layered on top of each other. To some, she's still the terrifying creature from childhood stories. To others, she's a tragic figure. To others, a symbol. And none of those perspectives are completely wrong. They're just incomplete on their own. And maybe that's what makes her story last so long. It doesn't settle into one meaning. It stays open. It keeps inviting people to look at it again from a different angle. Shocking fact: very few mythological figures have been reinterpreted as widely and as differently as Medusa, which is why her image and story continue to appear in art, literature, and culture even today. So when you hear her name now, it carries more than just one story. It carries all of them: the quiet girl in the temple, the cursed figure in isolation, the monster in the legend, the weapon in a hero's hand, the symbol on a shield, and the reinterpretations that came long after. All of it exists together, and maybe that's the closest thing to an ending her story ever gets. Not a conclusion, but a continuation. A story that keeps shifting depending on who's telling it, and why. And as we move into the final chapters, we're not just looking at what happened to Medusa anymore. We're looking at something deeper, what her story reveals about the way we see monsters, and how easily we forget the human parts behind them. You know, at this point, the story almost feels complete. We've seen where Medusa began, what happened to her, how her life changed, and how the world remembered her. But there's still something quietly sitting underneath all of it, something we haven't fully looked at yet. Not just what happened to Medusa, but how someone becomes a monster in the first place. Because, if you think about it, Medusa didn't wake up one day and decide to be feared. She didn't choose isolation. She didn't create the version of herself that people now recognize instantly. That version was built piece by piece through events, reactions, and decisions made by others. And that's a very different kind of story than the one we're usually told. Shocking fact: in many mythological traditions, monsters aren't always born. They're often created through punishment, transformation, or misunderstanding, which makes their stories less about evil and more about change. And once you start looking at it that way, it becomes harder to draw a clear line between monster and victim, because where exactly does that line begin? Is it at the moment of transformation? Is it when others start to fear you? Or is it when your story gets simplified into something easier to explain? In Medusa's case, it seems to be all of those things happening at once. The curse changes her form. The world reacts to that form with fear. And over time, that fear becomes the only thing people remember. Everything else fades into the background, and that process, it's surprisingly familiar even outside of mythology. Shocking fact: ancient Greek myths often reflect human social patterns like blame, reputation, and power, meaning stories like Medusa's can mirror real-world dynamics more than we might expect. Now think about the role of storytelling in all of this, because once a story starts being told, it doesn't stay exactly the same. People adjust it, shorten it, focus on the parts that get the strongest reaction, and over time, those parts become the story. In Medusa's case, the most striking detail is obvious: her gaze, her snakes, the danger. So that's what gets repeated, that's what gets remembered. And everything else, the quiet life, the lack of control, the unfairness becomes optional. Something you might hear if you dig deeper, but not something most people carry with them. Shocking fact: The more a story is retold, the more it tends to emphasize extreme or memorable elements, which is why many mythological figures become more exaggerated over time. And here's where it gets a little uncomfortable again, because once someone is labeled a monster, it changes how every part of their story is interpreted. Actions that might once have been seen as neutral, or even defensive, get reinterpreted as threatening. Silence becomes eerie, isolation becomes suspicious, and any harm connected to them, even if it wasn't intentional, proof that the label fits. It's like the story rewrites itself around that one idea, and Medusa's story follows that pattern almost perfectly. By the time most people hear about her, the label is already in place. There's no question left to ask. Shocking fact: in many myths, once a character is defined as a monster, their backstory becomes secondary or disappears entirely, reinforcing the idea that identity can be shaped more by perception than reality. So maybe the more important question isn't just what happened to Medusa, but why do we remember her the way we do? Because the answer to that question doesn't just explain her story, it explains something about storytelling itself, about how easily complexity can be reduced, how quickly a person can become a symbol, and how rarely we stop to look back and ask if that symbol ever told the full truth. And as we move forward, we're going to take that question even further, not just looking at Medusa anymore, but at what her story says about us, and the way we decide who deserves to be feared and who gets to be remembered differently. So now we get to a question that's a little harder to ignore: who actually decides what a story means? Because when you look back at everything that happened to Medusa, it's clear she never got to tell her own version. Not at the beginning, not during the transformation, not even at the end. Everything we know about her comes from someone else: poets, storytellers, historians, artist people who were never there, shaping her life into something that fits their narrative. And that's not unusual in mythology. Most figures don't get to speak for themselves, but in Medusa's case, that silence feels especially important, because it leaves space for interpretation, and that space has been filled in very different ways over time. Shocking fact: nearly all surviving versions of Medusa's story come from male authors in ancient Greece and Rome, which means her narrative has been filtered through perspectives that may not have prioritized her experience. And once you realize that, the story starts to feel less fixed, less certain, because if the meaning depends on who's telling it, then the meaning can change, and it has, drastically. Some storytellers focused on fear, turning Medusa into a warning about danger and consequences. Others, especially later writers, began to focus on injustice, highlighting the imbalance of power in her story. One of the most influential voices in that shift was Ovid, who added emotional depth and emphasized the idea that transformation was a punishment she didn't deserve, and that single perspective shaped how millions of people would later understand her. Shocking fact: Ovid's version of Medusa, written centuries after the original Greek myths, is one of the main reasons she's often seen today as a tragic figure rather than just a monster. But here's something even more interesting: even Ovid's version isn't necessarily the truth. It's still an interpretation, a retelling, which means every version we have is part of a larger chain of storytelling, where each link adds, removes, or reshapes something, and over time, those changes build on each other. So instead of one clear story, you end up with layers, some focusing on fear, some on tragedy, some on symbolism, and depending on which layer you encounter first, that becomes your understanding of Medusa. Shocking fact: there is no original, complete canonical version of Medusa's story. What we have today is a collection of fragments and interpretations from different time periods, and that leads to a quieter realization. Maybe the most powerful part of Medusa's story isn't what happened to her, but what happened after. Not in the myth itself, but in the way people chose to remember it. Because every time someone tells her story, they make a choice. What to include, what to leave out, what to emphasize. And those choices matter. They shape how others see her, whether as something to fear, something to question, or something to understand. And over thousands of years, those choices have turned Medusa into something much bigger than a single character. She's become a reflection of how stories are told and how meaning is created. Shocking fact. Medusa is one of the most reinterpreted figures in mythology, appearing in everything from ancient shields to modern literature and art, each version reflecting a different perspective. So, as we move toward the final part of this story, it's worth holding on to that idea that what we're hearing now is just one way of looking at Medusa, a slower way, a quieter way, one that tries to bring back the parts that were left behind. But even this version isn't final, because stories like this don't really end. They continue every time someone hears them, retells them, or sees something new in them. And maybe that's the most lasting thing about Medusa. Not the curse, not the fear, not even the tragedy, but the fact that her story never fully settles into just one meaning, you know. By now, you've probably noticed something a little different about the way we've been telling this story. We didn't rush to the ending. We didn't jump straight to the monster part. We slowed it down, and when you do that, something interesting happens. Details that usually get skipped start to matter, and Medusa's story is full of those details, because when people hear the name Medusa, they don't usually think about her life in the temple, or the moment everything changed, or the quiet isolation that followed. They think about the final image: snakes, stone, fear. But that's what happens when a story is told too quickly. You only see the result, not the process. Shocking fact, most simplified versions of myth focus almost entirely on her death at the hands of Perseus, skipping over most of her life entirely. And maybe that's something worth pausing on for a second, because how often do we do that? Not just with myths, but with stories in general. We look at the ending and assume it explains everything. If someone is feared, we assume they've always been that way. If someone is isolated, we assume they chose it. If someone is remembered as dangerous, we stop asking how they got there. And Medusa's story follows that exact pattern. The final version of her, one people recognize instantly, the only version that matters. Everything before that fades into the background. Shocking fact. In early Greek art, Medusa is often depicted in exaggerated, monstrous forms from the start, without any narrative context, which reinforces the idea that audiences were meant to accept her as a creature rather than question her origins. But when you slow things down, when you look at each step instead of just the outcome, the story starts to feel completely different. It's no longer just about fear, it's about change. About how quickly a life can shift when control is taken away, about how a single event can redefine everything that comes after, and maybe most importantly, about how easily that change can be misunderstood by others who only see the final result. Because from the outside, Medusa looks like a monster, but from the inside, from the version of the story we've been sitting with, she looks like someone who lost everything and had no way to get it back. Shocking fact. Medusa is one of the few mythological figures whose story can be interpreted almost entirely differently depending on where you choose to begin it. And here's where it gets even more interesting, because once you notice this pattern, you start to see it everywhere in storytelling. The faster a story is told, the simpler it becomes. And the simpler it becomes, the easier it is to pass on. But something is always lost in that process. Complexity, context, the parts that don't fit neatly into a quick explanation. And Medusa's story is one of those stories where what's lost might actually be the most important part, because without it, the story stops being about a person and becomes just an image, a symbol, something flat, something easy. Shocking fact: many myths that survive today are shortened versions of much longer oral traditions, meaning entire layers of meaning may have been lost over time. So as we keep going into the final part of this story, it's worth holding onto that slower perspective, not just rushing to what happens next, but staying with what we've already seen, because Medusa's story doesn't really change anymore in terms of events. What changes is how we understand it, and that shift from seeing something quickly to seeing it clearly is what turns this from just another myth into something that feels a little more real, a little more human, and a lot harder to ignore once you've seen it that way. So now, after everything we've walked through, there's one quiet question left hanging in the air. Which version of this story do we keep? Because by now, you've seen there isn't just one Medusa. There's the version most people know, the monster, the warning, the creature defeated by Perseus. But there's also the version we slowed down to see, the one that begins long before the curse, long before the fear, long before the story becomes something simple. And the truth is, both versions exist at the same time, but most people only carry one of them, and usually it's the simpler one. Shocking fact: in many Medusa's entire life is reduced to just a few lines, while Perseus's journey is expanded into a full, heroic narrative, showing how storytelling often prioritizes one perspective over another. And maybe that says something about how we process stories in general. We tend to keep the version that's easiest to remember, the one that fits neatly into categories like hero and monster, because those categories don't require much effort. They don't ask us to sit with discomfort or question what we've been told, but the slower version, the one with context, with uncertainty, with moments that don't feel fair, that version asks more from us. It asks us to pause, to think, to reconsider what we assumed at the beginning. And that's not always something people naturally do, especially when the simpler version is already so familiar. Shocking fact: many ancient myths were shaped over time to reinforce cultural values, which means the official versions often reflect what societies wanted to emphasize, not necessarily the full complexity of the original stories. But once you've seen both versions, it becomes hard to go back to just one, because now, when you hear the name Medusa, you don't just see the final image, you see the process that led there. You remember the quiet beginning, the moment everything changed, the isolation, the way her story was retold again and again until it became something else entirely. And that awareness changes the feeling of the story. Even if the events themselves stay the same, it adds weight, it adds context, it makes something that once felt distant feel a little more human. Shocking fact: modern reinterpretations of Medusa often focus more on her perspective than on Perseus's, reflecting a broader shift in storytelling toward understanding previously overlooked viewpoints. And here's something else to think about. The version of the story we keep doesn't just affect how we see Medusa, it affects how we see stories like hers in general. If we only keep the simplified version, then every similar story becomes predictable. Monsters are always monsters, heroes are always right, and the past doesn't need to be questioned. But if we allow for the slower version, the more detailed one, then suddenly those categories start to blur. And once they blur, we start asking different questions, not just what happened, but why, and was it fair, and who got to decide. Shocking fact: reinterpretations of myths often reveal as much about the time they're retold in as they do about the original story, showing how meaning evolves alongside human perspectives. So as we move into the final chapter, there isn't really a single conclusion waiting for us. There's no moment where everything neatly resolves or suddenly makes perfect sense. Instead, there's a choice, a quiet one, the choice of how we remember this story moving forward, whether we go back to the fast version or stay with the slower one a little longer, because Medusa's story doesn't end in a way that tells you what to think. It ends in a way that leaves that decision entirely up to you. So, here we are at the end of the story, and if you've stayed this long, you probably feel it too that this wasn't really the kind of story you thought it would be at the beginning. It didn't feel like a battle. It didn't feel like a simple tale of good versus evil. It felt slower than that, quieter, a story that asked you to sit with it instead of rushing past it. And maybe that's the only way a story like this can really be understood, because if you look at Medusa now, after everything we've gone through, she doesn't feel like just a monster anymore. She feels like something more complicated, something harder to label. And maybe that's the point. Shocking fact. In many modern interpretations, Medusa is no longer treated as a villain at all, but as one of the most misunderstood figures in mythology. If you go back to the beginning, to that quiet temple, to a life that wasn't meant to become a legend, it's hard not to notice how much of her story was shaped by things she never chose, the attention she didn't ask for, the moment she couldn't control, the punishment that followed, and the transformation that took everything familiar and replaced it with something isolating. And from there, everything else just kept building. The fear, the rumors, the hunters, the ending, and even after that, the way her story was told, simplified, repeated, reshaped. It's like her life moved in one direction the entire time, without ever really giving her a chance to step out of it. Shocking fact. Medusa is one of the rare mythological figures whose entire narrative arc from human to monster to symbol can be traced through different historical sources. And maybe that's why her story still stays with people, even now. Not just because of how it looks, but because of how it feels once you slow it down. Because somewhere in all of this, there's a pattern that feels familiar. The way someone can be defined by a single moment. The way a story can be told so many times that it stops being questioned. The way a person can become a symbol and lose the details that made them human in the first place. And when you notice that, it's hard not to see Medusa's story as something more than just mythology. It starts to feel like a reflection of how stories end, stories can shape the way we see people. Shocking fact. Medusa's image has been used across centuries, not just in myth, but in art, politics, and cultural commentary, often representing ideas far beyond her original story. And yet, even with all of that, her story doesn't really tell you what to think. It doesn't give you a clear answer or a final judgment. It just lays everything out, slowly, piece by piece, and leaves the meaning open. You can see her as a monster. You can see her as a victim. You can see her as a symbol of something larger. Or maybe you see a little bit of all of those things at once, and that openness, that lack of a single fixed meaning, might be the most lasting part of her story, because it means it doesn't end here. It continues, quietly, every time someone hears it again and pauses long enough to look a little deeper. Shocking fact. Myths that remain relevant over time are often the ones that allow multiple interpretations, and Medusa's story is one of the most flexible in that sense. So as you settle in, maybe getting a little more relaxed, a little more distant from the details, there's no big final message waiting at the end, just a quieter thought to carry with you, that sometimes the stories we think we understand the most are the ones we've only seen the fastest version of, and when we slow them down, even just a little, they start to change. Not because the events are different, but because we finally notice what was there all along. And maybe tonight, as this story fades into the background, that's enough.